Okay, well today we're going to catch up on Palo Alto's largest infrastructure project since the construction of Oregon Expressway, which is the reconfiguration of the city's rail crossings. And at the end of the webcast, we're going to catch up real quick on the City Council's decision Monday night about the zoning changes that affect the President Hotel. December 2018, this was supposed to be a fairly significant month for this project, Gennady. Where are we at?
Well, we're at a point where the city is narrowing down its list of alternatives while simultaneously coming up with new ones. So on the one hand, the city is making progress. It had like 34 alternatives earlier in the year. Now it's down to about 5 or 7, depending on how you count the new options that are coming up. But we should get a lot more clarity on December 17th, the council's final meeting of the year, which promises to be a legislative extravaganza like no other.
Get all the business done.
Well, it's starting with a proclamation for Jim Keane. It's ending with salaries for top city workers, and you got 24 items in between, including the council's latest check-in on grade separation, which has been one of their big goals for the year.
Yeah.
So just to catch up on where we are right now, there's 4 rail crossings, as everyone knows, where the city is trying to come up with grade separation options. And this, so far, like the council's rail committee and the citizens advisory group, known as I think it's community advisory panel, they pretty much determined that the focus for those big, huge ideas should be in the 2 southern crossings, which is East Meadow and Charleston. The ones in the north, the city recognizes that it needs to do something about them, but the proposals so far are much less ambitious, even though there's still this consideration of what's known as the hybrid option, which is where you simultaneously raise the rail and lower the roads at Palo Alto Avenue. I think the most of the thinking right now is just about closing those crossings to traffic near the Caltrain right away, and then pursuing all sorts of other kind of improvements, like around bike paths and things like that, to kind of smooth the flow. But for the 2 southern crossings, there's still kind of 3 big ideas that would cost hundreds of $millions. One of them is the trench. The other one is the viaduct, which is aerial. And the third one is the hybrid, which we just mentioned. And so we're going to get some more clarification on Monday as to how the council feels about these options, as well as the new one, which we may get into.
Yeah, so if this were the process of choosing a softball team, I would say the viaduct option is the skinny kid with big Coke bottle glasses.
Yeah, it's me.
That everyone thinks, well, we don't really want him on the team, but we have to. And then the tunnel, the deep bore tunnel, people are still holding on to that idea. Very expensive, according to the consultants.
Yeah, it's the high-priced free agent that a small market team is gunning for.
Yes.
It's like, he has the Brewers, you could get Madison Bumgarner. Anyway, so that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So they're both kind of unlikely, and just because of the expenses, but not impossible. There's just a lot of challenges to be worked out, both politically and financially, and from the engineering standpoint.
Yeah, there's creeks involved and all of that. It seems like, I mean, this has just been a huge and messy process, and even though we can say, hey, the city was intending to make its final selection this month, I mean, there's been any number of different configurations at 4 different crossings, and then there was the decision about the process, who should be involved, who are the stakeholders, how are they going to give their input, lots of discussion around that. So in a sense, yeah, it is amazing that we've come from 34 or so to now the 5.
Where are we in the process compared to other cities?
Well, Palo Alto kind of has its own process apart from other cities. I feel like grade separation is something that other cities care about very much, but they've been working on this for years, and even when this whole started, Palo Alto was already way behind. Like specifically, I'm thinking of Sunnyvale and Mountain View, which are the 2 cities that are, like Palo Alto, are eligible for county funds that would make this possible. So I think even when the council began discussing this after its retreat this month, there was a general sense that Palo Alto needs to catch up, and I don't think in the past year it's really overtaken those cities, but it has made some progress, albeit in a very non-linear fashion.
Yeah. Let's talk about the tunnel, because that has been a very popular option. It's still one of the 5, I believe, that are that are on the table?
Well, the five I'm thinking of pertain to particular crossings, but there's also kind of the bigger option, which I guess would be a sixth, which is the all-city tunnel.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like one of those options that staff keeps on saying it's extremely expensive. There's all these challenges, and it would be just for Palo Alto. You can't. It's hard to get other cities on board with that, and so. But it's a bit of almost like a pipe dream or a moonshot or whatever, pick your metaphor. But it's so popular that the city has a hard time completely eliminating it. So every time it gets to the cusp of saying, let's be realistic, we can't do it, there's always a motion that says, well, let's get more information. And so it's kind of still alive.
Okay.
And there are some proponents, but there's also a new idea, which is a much shortened tunnel
Yeah.
that has recently emerged.
Yeah, let's talk about that, the South Palo Alto tunnel plus freight.
Yeah, this is an option that's been recommended by CARD, California's Advocating Responsible Rail Design, which have been very engaged in the process and which have done a lot of analysis and work on figuring out the best options. This is not in the mix of kind of alternatives that the city is doing a deep study on right now, but it is something that has emerged recently as a pretty popular option for a couple of reasons. If you build a tunnel, basically the option is in the south part of the city, have a tunnel, and over the tunnel lead the tracks which only freight would use. And the idea is freight only comes around like 3 times a day and night, so it's hardly there. So having a little bit of train traffic, it's not going to be that huge deal.
Be essentially like not having a rail
Yeah,
there.
but by allowing freight to stay there and not being forced to bring freight underground, you can avoid some onerous design exemptions, like this whole idea of 1% or 2% grade. Like, if it's just a passenger train, it should be a lot easier to get that kind of exception, which is what San Francisco did, kind of in its northern segment near Transbay.
So that's interesting. So the grade percentage only applies if it's to freight?
I have to look more into that, but I feel like the Caltrain has a standard of 1%, I think, for everything. You could get exceptions for 2%, and I think you would still need to get exception for 2%, but I just feel like it would be a lot easier if freight is not in the mix.
If freight's taken away, yeah.
Yeah, and there's other ideas that CARD is saying should make this more appealing option, including the cost. This thing could be much cheaper when compared to like a trench, because with a trench, there's all sorts of engineering challenges. It would go through the creeks, which is a huge issue, whereas a tunnel, you could bore it a deep tunnel under the creeks to avoid that. With a trench, you'd have to relocate utilities because the trench would run right through the underground utilities. Again, a tunnel could go right beneath them. And a trench would require digging throughout the whole length of the trench, whereas the tunnel, you'd basically have 2 spots where the tunnel starts and the tunnel begins. And there would be like a lot of disruptions in those areas, but it would be less disruptive than
What's the disruption for the trench as opposed to a tunnel? I thought I saw somewhere in here up to 5 years for some of these options.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's what I'm saying. Like the trench, you'd have to dig up the whole area. Tunnel, you would come in one end, and then you could have other things remain as they are, and then come back out. I'm not sure the exact time it would take to construct either, because this city hasn't done like a full analysis on this idea of having freight at grade and passenger trains in a tunnel. The rail committee just discussed this for the first time really a couple of weeks ago, and they've kind of acknowledged that they don't know that much about it, and staff said that this is not within the current scope of what its consultant is analyzing. And I should point out, each option costs like hundreds of thousands of dollars to analyze, so staff is a little cautious about just throwing new options out there for full analysis when you're supposed to be like at the finish line of the process. But in this case, they did make a motion, the rail committee did, in late November, to basically ask staff to maybe come up with more information about this option, and possibly by modifying what was in its original scope, which was a full tunnel from one end of the city to another. So instead of doing that, they might consider a more limited tunnel with freight at grade.
Yeah. Maybe this is the appropriate time to kind of get to the idea of what does it mean to come up with a preferred solution? Like, what is the city going to do with those options? They're going to study them? They're going to do feasibility studies at that point over the selected?
Presumably, the end game is to actually build these things
Well, yes.
and to prevent.
But what does February mean?
Well, once they decide what they want, they could refine their analysis. They could start doing the kind of design and environmental work that you would need to actually get the work done. That in itself is going to take like a couple of years at least. So you can get started on that. You can start to have a more realistic grasp of how much this will cost and pursue the funding that you would need to get them, whether by passing a business tax, maybe be a little more aggressive in pursuing Measure B funding for the county, which is still kind of tied up in litigation, but at some point is going to be available to the 3 North County cities. But I think the biggest thing is you could finally start working on the EARs and the design stuff and kind of refine these things.
Okay. So one of the things that we haven't talked about is the staff recommendation to remove the northernmost rail crossing, Palo Alto Avenue, from this whole grade separation discussion. Let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, like Palo Alto Avenue, I think technically the hybrid option, which is slightly raised rail and slightly lowered roads, is still in the mix. But there's been a lot of talk about Palo Alto Avenue being kind of its own beast because it's in downtown. There's all sorts of issues around it involving like the transit station and which is like the second busiest Caltrain station in the whole system. And so there's a recommendation that has recently emerged to, instead of pursuing that as part of this plan, to kind of have a whole new coordinated downtown plan, get all the stakeholders involved, get Stanford involved, property owners, and kind of have a whole downtown focused conversation that's, would be more specific to Palo Alto Avenue and various other improvements. And a similar thing is taking place around Embarcadero, which is which is close to the second crossing on Churchill. There's been a bit of friction in neighborhoods around Churchill and Embarcadero because the city initially considered grade separation around Churchill, and there was a big uproar from the neighborhood because there's not a lot of space in the corridor, and so you would need some property seizures, and that became a huge issue. So the council pretty much said, okay, we're not going to grade separate Churchill. Instead, we're just going to possibly close it to traffic. That's how we'll handle that grade crossing. But then if you do that, then that's going to bring a lot more cars to Embarcadero, which is just north of Churchill. And so the idea is you'd have to couple the Churchill option with some kind of improvements to Embarcadero. And again, that's a very touchy subject for neighbors who live in Embarcadero because they feel like this is just going to drive more traffic towards their neighborhood, force a lot of cars to divert to neighborhood streets. And so they're going to work that out. And I think the feeling is also that Embarcadero could function on its own also as part of its own project, which involves kind of rethinking the existing underpass, which is really awkward and clunky and hampered by weird timing.
There's been this kind of tension between should we be considering these rail crossings individually and separately, or should we acknowledge that there's a network of roads and patterns of traffic, and how do we address all the needs of everyone? And it seems like South Palo Alto, for example, the East Meadow and the Charleston, those are very much being considered as a unit.
Right.
And then the question is, what do you do in North Palo Alto?
Yeah, it's interesting. Like in the process of narrow down options, I feel like the process is really kind of splintered. I feel like going towards the East Meadow and Charleston solution has been fairly straightforward, which is kind of interesting because that's the most complex and potentially expensive solution on the table. Yeah. But for the other two, I feel like the city is kind of taking a path away from this process and kind of launching separate processes, which could involve new area plans and all sorts of kind of ideas. So as I said, this is not in any way a linear kind of process that we envisioned, where we starting in January and get to a decision in December.
Yeah.
They have eliminated a bunch of options. There's been quite a bit of outreach, and there has been a lot of input from the citizen committee. But I feel like the closer you come to a decision, the more problems pop up and the more potential solutions pop up that need to be analyzed further.
Yeah. So some of these new ideas for like Embarcadero Road, for example, what does the process do with these ideas at this point? Because we've got 2 months left, basically.
I feel like at this point, I don't think these are going to be integrated in the process anytime like in the very near future. I think the people who presented the idea, which is a group of Old Palo Alto residents, Antonio Carrasco, who lives in South Palo Alto, it's 2 Old Palo Alto residents, I should say, not a big group. So it's basically coming up with concepts to kind of like spark thinking. There hasn't been a lot of like engineering done. It's just kind of concepts, and they involve basically changing the underpass, bringing underpass at grade. So instead of that Embarcadero dip near Town Country, you'd have it at grade, and you'd move the train to a viaduct. And they're saying when you do that, you really have interesting solutions for improving traffic, such as maybe getting a traffic circle, having new like exit ramps off Alma onto Embarcadero, which right now you cannot do. Maybe have some modifications to Embarcadero itself to smooth traffic flow. So they're saying that they want to come up with solutions that are look at it on a system-wide basis and with the goal of kind of having no property seizures and improving kind of the traffic flow everywhere.
Yeah, it seems like a Rubik's Cube of a problem.
It is, but there's some interesting ideas, and I hope they get evaluated further, possibly on a separate track from the Great Separation discussion.
Yeah. So we're here in December. They have a goal of February. What's happening now? Who's meeting between now and February?
Well, the city council is going to meet on this on Monday, as we mentioned. The community advisory panel is going to meet, I think, on January 9th, I believe, early January. And then the current schedule, and I should always point out, it's always tentative and always subject to revisions. But I think in February, the city council is supposed to actually make a decision on this is what we're going to pursue.
Okay. Is the rail committee meeting between now and then, or is it done?
I'm not exactly sure.
I know it's never done, but
Well, the rail committee, as it stands now, is done because two members won't be on the council anymore.
Yeah.
Corey Welbeck and Greg Scharf. Not exactly sure if they have any meetings. I imagine they'll have at least one in January. I'll have to check the schedule, but the two big meetings are this Monday's city council meeting and the one in February where they make their final choice.
okay. We will be keeping a close eye on this, as always, on Palo Alto Online. And then let's talk really quickly about the City Council's decision on zoning changes on the President Hotel. You've both been covering the President Hotel and its implications for the tenants especially. What kind of emerged out of this attempt to address the so-called errors in the zoning code, in the grandfathered
Speaking of taking an
facilities?
unexpected turn, here's another instance of that happening. Well, as we reported in the past, staff has identified what it considered an administrative error, this grandfather clause, the grandfather facility clause that prevents non-conforming buildings that undergo renovations in downtown to maintain same use. And so they brought forward a proposal to correct it, which coincided with AJ Capital's desired timeline for this happening, which is the developer trying to convert Hotel President. And so the council rejected the idea that this is something that urgently needs to be fixed on an interim basis.
That was proposed, recommended by the
which
staff.
was recommended by staff. They saw no reason why this is a public health and safety and wellness matter that requires urgency. They did, however, agree that it should be fixed because this is an error. And so they decided to follow their normal kind of planning process, send it to the Planning Commission, let the Planning Commission discuss it, and then have it come back to the council. And what this obviously means is that by doing that, the council will not meet the kind of deadlines that AJ Capital has set for the city, which is a very unusual process. And furthermore, the council decided that it wants to add a provision that says this will not happen with residential properties looking to convert to commercial use. That will still not be allowed. So this would specifically impact Hotel President and any other like housing development in downtown that wants to go commercial.
Yeah, so the revision of the code back to what it was pre-January 2016 won't affect the residential grandfathered facilities. Yeah.
Probably not. There's a waiver clause, which we can't get into.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things, many things here. So first of all, there's an at-place memo, which means that it wasn't released to the public until the council meeting. It wasn't released to the council members until the at-place memo included 3 options from the staff.
Well, yeah, this is stuff that was presented at the meeting. I think before the Monday meeting, the only thing that staff had proposed is let's restore the zoning code to what it was before January 2016, which is when this error was made. So just get rid of this, like these 7 words or these 9 words that were accidentally copy and pasted into this clause. Just basically go back to 2016 before January. And then, so that was the only recommendation. And then on Monday, they presented a couple of more options. And the one that the council chose was the one that calls for creating an exception for residential switching to commercial. And again, neither I nor the council has apparently seen this before it was presented.
Yeah.
And another thing that was presented is this new waiver clause that I just mentioned, which is something that the city attorney proposed. And basically what this clause says, if you include this ban on residential to commercial, we should have some legal language that says that a developer could request a waiver from this restriction, provided he or she could show that this would be in conflict with state or federal laws. Which
The council members didn't really react well to that. Well, they questioned it significantly, I'd say.
and some members of the community did too. They're saying this is just a loophole for AJ Capital to ram their project through anyway.
Yeah.
You know, now the law says you can't do it, but you could ask for a waiver, and then AJ Capital's attorneys have been saying all along that this conflicts with the Ellis Act and other laws, so it's hard to imagine them not using that. At which point, city planners and the city attorney's office and city council will have another decision to make.
And the city attorney asserted that this kind of language should be in the code in general, and it's not, but why not put it here in this one? That was the reason given.
Yeah, she called it housekeeping.
And what do we know about how this decision on Monday to send this zoning change to the Planning and Transportation Commission instead of acting on it immediately? What do we know about how that affects tenants?
Well, I was in contact with one tenant, and essentially all of the tenants have been penalized in regards of payments that they would have received if the council had passed the ordinances, and if the tenants would have gotten payments half their rent amounts through June, and now it's null and void. So they're just getting what was required by the city, the $3,900 payment for relocation assistance, but anything beyond that, now they don't have access to. And the 25 tenants who are remaining in the building now will only have, according to who I spoke to, until the end of January to remain in the building, and then they have to leave. Whereas before there was a possibility that they'd be able to stay until June.
It's important to point out that even if the council did everything that staff had initially recommended, it still wouldn't have helped the tenants because the agreement that would have allowed them to stay until June would have also required the city to take several other actions independent of this.
Parking was one of them.
Downtown cap is probably the biggest one, I imagine.
Yeah.
That's not happening this year now.
Yeah. Was this, what you got from the tenant, was that actually communicated? Do we know from AJ Capital in this past week, or this is just the tenant's sort of reading of the
This is just the tenant reading over the agreement that tenants had signed, because those who moved out in November weren't paid one big sum for moving out on time. They were going to get paid over a period of time.
And let's talk quickly about the council members and how they kind of fell out in this decision. So Greg Scharf actually recused himself.
Yeah, I think he owns property nearby, so that was the reason.
Yeah. And then the vote itself was 6-2.
Yes, there were a few dissenters. I think Adrian Fine thought that there were two competing proposals. Adrian Fine first made the motion, which was to do pretty much what staff had recommended.
Adopted on a temporary basis.
Adapted on a temporary basis, and then on a separate track, send it to Planning Commission to consider and come back to the council for a more permanent one. He thought this would kind of insulate the city legally. And he also supported the option, what was known as option 3, which is kind of banning the residential to commercial.
Okay.
So he didn't oppose that. It was more about legal protection. So he dissented, and then Greg Tanaka also dissented because he didn't want to be associated with the recommendation for option 3. He just thought the Planning Commission should look at all options, kind of come up without being restricted to that.
Come up with their own recommendations.
Yeah, so this ended up being a 6-2 vote with Greg Scharf recusing on those grounds.
And Interim Planning Director Jonathan Late was indicating to the council that it would take at least 6 months, or even the first half of the year, for the Planning Commission to get to this item and then have it come back to council. Council kind of did a hurry up part in the motion, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think they recognize that there is a legal threat, and I mean, there's been a few letters already from AJ Capital's attorney, kind of asserting their right to sue the city on this. And I think, considering how careful the city attorney is about including this waiver clause and everything, I do think that they are a little scared of getting sued. But so they want to move fast. But yeah, the planning staff came back with we have so much to do, so it's going to take a while, which again doesn't explain why they got this in front of the council just this past week so urgently. But clearly they had enough time to bring it last week. So
sure. So 2019 will shape up to be an interesting year, especially at the very beginning. We'll find out what happens with rail and with zoning in downtown. So thanks very much. That wraps it up for this week's edition of Behind the Headlines. Stay up to date on all of the latest Palo Alto news on paloaltoonline.com. If you want to talk about some of these topics, you can go to Town Square, which is at paloaltoonline.com/square. And conversations are also happening on our pages on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you like this news show and want to show your support, we'd love it if you would subscribe or hit the thumbs up button below. We've also got a podcast version on iTunes and Google Play, so please subscribe or download that as well. We'll see you in 2 weeks for our year-end wrap-up of all the best stories in 2018. See you then.